Hello everybody and welcome back to Rotberg. If you're wondering why everything looks a little bit different right now, it's because I'm back home in Ireland for the summer and I of course didn't bring my entire studio setup with me. But today I've got a story to tell you that I'm so excited to talk about that I forgot to record an intro when I recorded the whole thing. So here I am doing the intro now. And today I'm going to be talking about diamonds. Kind of. Now, before I start crap talking them too much, don't get me wrong, diamonds are objectively beautiful. Its wider usage goes back to at least the 4th century BC in India, where they were used for decoration, yes, but also tools for engraving metal, and their near invincible quality made them a powerful amulet for warriors going into battle. The one thing they weren't used for, except for on very, very rare occasions, was engagement rings. That practice only goes back to the way, way past of 1947, when the De Beers diamond behemoth launched the ad campaign, Diamonds Are Forever, which started the whole toxic culture of, well, how can he afford to have a wife and start a family if he can't even afford to throw away some money on a nice stone? Such a successful ad campaign was it that nowadays almost 80% of all engagement rings sold contain a diamond. And although the ad campaign is now long over, it's so baked into our society that I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So, if you're wondering how a diamond, not even that rare in terms of rare gemstones, as one article I read put it, how many people do you know own a diamond? Now how many people do you know own a sapphire, a ruby, an emerald? Diamonds are actually pretty common, geologically speaking at least. Well, that's what we're going to be really talking about today. Cecil Rhodes, the Colossus. So stick around if you want to find out how Cecil Rhodes almost single-handedly created modern diamond culture, became one of the wealthiest men to ever live, personally owned a country, and accidentally laid the groundworks for apartheid in South Africa. Today is going to be a big one, so strap in, and thanks for joining me on this. Now, back to Darren in the studio. Our story today begins in the small town of Hertfordshire, some 30 miles outside the city of London. There was a vicar by the name of Reverend Francis William Rhodes. His first wife had died while giving birth to his first daughter, and 9 years later he met a lady by the name of Louisa Peacock, who was to give him 2 more daughters, and 8 more sons. Now, because this is the Victorian era, the size of the family wasn't strange, though the family themselves was anything but normal. 9 of the kids would live to adulthood, though only 2 of them would ever get married. But the focus of our story today is on the 5th born son. Cecil John Rhodes was born on July 5th, 1853. The Reverend Frank was, according to servants, a very stern and eccentric man. Whatever eccentric meant for the time, we can only guess. But from his kids, we know that he had a very domineering personality and a very puritanical view on life, which must have been very fun growing up in the house. Thankfully though, this seems to have been offset by Louisa's naturally warm and caring personality. And even though she had a soccer team worth of children to raise, she always seemed to have time for every one of them. And Cecil was a bit of a mama's boy, even saying about her, "My mother got through an amazing amount of work. She must have had the gift of organisation, for she was never flustered and seemed always to have ample time to listen to all our many and, to us, vastly important affairs." If you're wondering why a man would praise his mother's organisational skills above all else, it'll make a lot more sense when you see what kind of man Cecil becomes. But although he was a bit of a mama's boy, this feeling did go both ways, as the servants recalled him being the only kid they ever heard Louisa call "my darling." So there's this weird feeling of Cecil being a middle kid with first kid energy that gave him a lot of leeway and let him get away with murder as a kid. Robert I. Rotberg says in the book The Founder, Cecil Rhodes and the Pursuit of Power, it was that special love which was the foundation of his invincible self-confidence, an affirmative sense of self which was both a spur to accomplishment and a resilient buffer against the ravages of failure. To his credit and discredit, Rhodes throughout his lifetime was remarkably free of both guilt and shame. This might be my Catholic upbringing shining through here, but nobody should ever be completely free of guilt and shame. Now, I've already mentioned servants a few times, so you'd be thinking the Rhodes family must be wealthy, and you'd be 100% correct. Louise's family were landlords on a mind-boggling scale, and her father even served as a member of parliament while she was raising the kids. Though the vicar's side of the family was nothing near destitute either. His family going back generations had been yeomen and traders, while of course also being landlords on a colossal scale. Even by 1901, Cecil and his siblings were receiving rent from over 1,600 properties. So they were very, very high middle class, but still just couldn't punch through that glass ceiling into the very high strata of British old money that had gone back centuries. Despite all of their wealth, the Rhodes family couldn't afford to send Cecil to a very fancy private school and had to settle with the nearby grammar school. At school, just as at home, Cecil was a bit of a loner, not helped by some of his quirks of personality. His brothers called him Long-Headed Cecil, whatever that means, and apparently the nickname kind of stuck. What also didn't help is because of his puritanical upbringing, he would blush at the slightest mention of sex. And not helping anything else, when he was an adolescent, the boy declared that he would never marry in his life. So, if you're a teenage boy, don't declare that you're going to be a virgin forever. It's not going to end well. But it's around this time that he started to make some plans for his bone-dry future. And here again, his father seemed to just hit it out of the park as a father. Cecil would say about him, "My father frequently, and I am now sure wisely, demolished many of my dreams. But when I had rebuilt them on practical lines, he was ready to listen again. He never failed to put his finger on the weak spots, and his criticism soon taught me to consider a question from every possible point of view." Now, even though his father was doing an excellent job of crushing his dreams for him, there was one more thing holding him back from achieving his dreams of attending Oxford University, and that was his health. Cecil had always been a sickly boy, but after finishing grammar school, things took a turn for the worse. After a medical checkup, the doctor advised him to take things easy due to some problems with his heart. And because this was still 1870, medicine hadn't really evolved beyond the point of, hey, get some fresh air into you. It might help. And so the doctor prescribed him a voyage to where the air was drier. And to quote from the excellent book, The Flawed Colossus by Brian Roberts, "After studying Rhodes' symptoms, both as a youth and in later years, Dr. Shee suggests that he was suffering from atrial septal defect, the most common congenital deformity of the heart among adults, known to laymen as a hole in the heart. Difficult to diagnose in the 19th century, it nevertheless seems to be confirmed by Rhodes' symptoms." Because this was still Imperial Britain, there is a long-standing tradition of boys being sent off to one of the colonies like America or India so boys could come back a man. At this point in time, though, the colony to earn your stripes was Africa, specifically the African Cape Colony, roughly more or less modern-day South Africa. There were also some ulterior motives to the family's decision to send Rhodes here, though, and that was they wanted to make a bunch of money. To that end, they sent him off with a few £1,000s in his pocket as an investment, definitely no small amount of money at the time. And while Rhodes was disappointed that he couldn't start his Oxford journey yet, he had described England as being deadly monotonous, and so he was looking forward to the adventure. Plus, his brother Herbert had already set up a cotton farm in the Cape Colony, so he wouldn't be starting off from scratch. So, in June of 1870, at the ripe old age of 17, Cecil set off on a voyage that would change the world. Cecil Rhodes disembarked in a town called Durban, where white colonizers mingled with Zulu tribespeople who had been pulled into the fold. Although the British had fought the very famous Shaka Zulu decades before in 1828, the outright Anglo-Zulu War wouldn't take place for another few years to come. But still, there was understandably some tension. For now, the British weren't worried about the Zulu. They were worried about the Dutch, who had two colonies set up to the east of the Cape Colony. There was the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. These were both Afrikaans-speaking colonies set up by Boers, or farmers in Dutch, who had excluded black people from all forms of church and state. They'd been there since the 17th century, when the Dutch East India Company set up the colonies on the Cape of Good Hope as a resupply point before they went to go pillage and murder everything east of Africa. So now, faced with the encroachment of Dutch and English settlers, the tribespeople there were forced with a tough decision. Either try to live alongside this alien culture who was destroying their way of life, or they could retreat onto less desirable land away from the water, land that their ancestors had avoided for good reason. To make matters far worse for the indigenous population, the year before, in 1869, a giant 83.5 carat diamond named the Star of South Africa was found near the Orange River, and it drove people wild with speculation. But that's enough of the historical context for now. Let's get back to what Cecil was doing. By the time he had arrived at his brother's farm in Natal, there was no sign of Herbert to be found. All he saw was a lazily scrawled note and a poorly drawn map of the farm. The note said that Herb had gone off to prospect in the diamond mines, but surely his teenage brother would have no problems managing the giant farm on his own. Herbert did eventually return from the diamond mines, and he had found some stuff, but nothing to really make the trip worth it. On top of that, sifting through buckets full of dirt and sand was not really the work that Herbert was cut out for, so he thought a return back to the predictable cotton fields would have been best. And after a few months' work, the two brothers had actually over 100 acres of cotton planted, and Cecil actually seemed to enjoy the work. On top of this, he developed a philosophy that, in the minds of other people, would be a good thing, but Cecil would tangle it up with racism and create an incredibly destructive philosophy. See, he saw anybody who worked hard was a good chap, and anyone else was just a loafer. I'm going to just put a pin in that for now, but just remember, the man despises anything that he sees as laziness. Months would pass, and Herb quickly got bored again and went in search of diamonds, leaving his still not yet 18-year-old brother in charge of the farm. Though under Cecil's management, the farm did well. And the most important lesson he learned during all of this was when he started to give his African workers loans. Now, these weren't for free, he was still charging interest. But he found by trusting them with loans, it made those workers more loyal to him, attracted more workers to him, and made all of those workers work harder. He quickly learned that a little bit of bribery can go a long way when placed in the right places. Cecil Lynn wrote home explaining that he preferred work in the predictable fields over the whims of diamond mining. But this attitude wouldn't last very long, because it was then that on a farm owned by two De Beer brothers in 1871 that would change everything. Those diamonds were found at a place called Kimberly and made even the most sober men froth at the mouth for a taste. One of these sober young men was our Cecil, who set up in the town of New Rush by November 1871, less than a year after arriving in Africa. Now, any romantic ideals for any young British men of finding diamonds in the African wilderness would have quickly been dashed by the sight and smell of New Rush. In lieu of toilets, men just dug holes in the ground for latrines. Carcasses were just tossed aside when they were done with to rot under the sun. All of this, along with a lack of fresh food and water, meant that soon outbreaks of diarrhea, dysentery and fever were widespread. But Cecil only had eyes for the hill. There was a hill by the name of Colesberg Kopje that Cecil described in a letter to his mother thusly. Imagine a small round hill at its highest point only 30 feet above the level of the surrounding country, about 180 yards broad and 220 feet long. I should like you to have a peep at the kopje from my tent door at this present moment. It is like an immense number of ant heaps covered with black ants, as thick as can be, the latter represented by human beings. Within a few months, these so-called ants had turned what was a hill into a hole that was some 60 foot deep, uncovering roughly 40 to 50,000 pounds of diamonds every week. In today's money, that's about 2.5 to 3.2 million pounds every week. Soon this hole became kind of a tourist attraction that, in proper British fashion, quickly became labelled as, wait for it, Big Hole. Genius. The two Rhodes brothers quickly snatched up 3 plots and got to work. While at the start, the brothers were doing a lot of their digging themselves, a lot of the work was still left to their African workers. But Cecil teamed up with another budding entrepreneur and decided to make money off of the other miners. They did this by buying an ice machine and using that to serve ice cream and cold drinks to the miners. This eventually grew into a business where they would buy and lease water pumps to drain any mines that the workers were digging, living up to the gold rush motto of, if you want to make money, don't dig gold, sell shovels. Oddly enough, for someone who was so distant and unknowable his entire life, Cecil was usually the one sent to seal the deal, because he was a very, very smooth talker, and Rod was kind of a lightweight, where Cecil could drink with the hardest miners there were. So as antisocial as he was, he loved going to parties, if even just for an excuse to get drunk. Then when all the nice white people in the colony used to go to dances, Rhodes, having no sexual interest in women, used to pick, as he called them, the plainest girls in the room to dance. Then when striking up a conversation with these women, he used to tell them outright that he was only dancing with them for the exercise. Now, although this might sound like he's trying a tactic from a pickup artist he saw on TikTok, this brings up something that's talked about Rhodes a lot, if not too much. And that is the fact that Cecil Rhodes, for his entire life, was almost certainly a closeted homosexual man. But because it was illegal to be gay, he could never confide in a partner, and because of his puritanical upbringing, he could never really admit it to himself. And it's actually quite probable that he died a virgin. Now, a lot of biographers give his sexuality a lot of weight, and obviously as a straight man, I have no idea what kind of mental complexes hiding your sexuality might bring out. But I do know that there were a lot of other closeted homosexual men in that time who didn't go on to do all of the horrific things that Cecil Rhodes did. So I don't think it's as important to the story as some might say. He could have gone on to be another Oscar Wilde or something, but we'll see what Cecil Rhodes does. While Cecil was working on these ventures for a few months, Herbert had gone back for a visit to England to visit his family. But when he got back, Cecil fell ill again. It's thought by biographers that this is the first mini heart attack that Cecil would suffer throughout the rest of his life. And now this is something that would affect his outlook massively. Though he was still only 19 or 20 years old, he now knew that his time on this earth was scarce, and it was up to him to squeeze as much out of the world before he died. So in the summer of 1873, he decided to take a break from the manual labour, and he set sail for home, where he could finally live his dream of attending Oxford University. It had been Cecil's dream for years to attend Oxford like the rest of British elite and become a barrister. Though he seemed to be a very lacklustre student, he got called up many times for his lack of attendance and overall apathy towards education. But they couldn't really kick the guy out because he used to just bring a box of diamonds to class as a kind of show and tell. So the administrators realised this guy was soon going to be filthy rich, and so it would be best to stay on his good side. And this paid off because in his will, Cecil Rhodes left £100,000, or about 12.5 million in today's money, to the establishment. At Oxford University today, there's still a statue of Cecil Rhodes, which came under fire in recent years in what's called the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Instead, Oxford just put up a plaque beside him saying that Cecil Rhodes was a committed colonialist who exploited African workers to make his money. As important as Cecil's money had been for Oxford, Oxford was far more important for Cecil, as it gave him a philosophical, almost religious belief in what was to be his life's work. Up until now, he just wanted to make some money while he was young and get a respectable job. Here though, while mingling with the chinless aristocracy of Oxford, he decided to go all in on colonialism. He went one better than most contemporaries though, writing at the age of just 24. Keep in mind, this was written by a 24-year-old. Quote, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that the more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honourable race the world possesses." If it wasn't already clear from him calling white dudes the most human, this may very well be one of the earliest forms of modern white supremacy. No longer was colonialism just about stealing land and mineral wealth. Now it was a cold, calculating decision to go into a foreign culture and replace as much of that culture and heritage as possible with Anglo-Saxon culture. Because apparently the cultures that were already there were too childlike or barbaric. Rhodes would hold the possession for the rest of his life that Africans and black people can someday, of course they can be seen as equal to white people. But right now they are currently the children of civilization and they need to be cured of their barbarism. Some biographers will argue that this means Rhodes wasn't racist. He wasn't rating these people based on the colour of their skin, just all of their cultural and core beliefs that make them a distinct group of people. So of course that argument is absolute BS. He was a total racist and didn't even try to hide it. He stated that with proper education and training, these children can be brought to the table as adults of capitalism, an attitude that would live on across various African colonies well after his death, which we will get to later. Rhodes, ignoring the fact that these people had survived in Africa since literally the dawn of humanity, apparently they're not quite human enough because they haven't figured out how to pump their water and air full of industrial runoff or how to force feed their children into machines. In later life, while speaking with a journalist, he said it was somehow Aristotle who inspired him, because Aristotle once said, again, fairly innocent to most people, Aristotle once said that man needs one idea so grand, so lofty, that he can dedicate his entire life to that one goal. Unfortunately, that one goal that Cecil picked was colonialism. This made sense too, as colonialism was picking up a lot of steam. 1874 would be the downfall of the British East India Company when the Crown took direct control of India. So the 1870s and 1880s were the height of British imperial power, and Cecil just wanted to keep that party going. Back to 1873 for now though, and Rhodes would have another relapse in health, which meant another return to Africa. He was starting to make good money between his mines and his various other ventures, but then a new law came in saying that no one man or company could own more than any 10 claims. This meant that instead of buying more claims, the biggest players instead just focused on amalgamating all of the claims. So you could turn 5 small mines into one, and then you say, hey, I don't have 5 claims anymore, I just have one big one. So for Rhodes, most of his claims were in the De Beers mine. And I'm going to hop around in the timeline a little bit because doing this in chronological order gets very messy very quickly. So, Rhodes founded the De Beers Mining Company in 1880 and spent the next few years buying out everyone around him and amalgamating more and more mines through either buyouts, bribery, or straight up hostile takeovers. A lot of this is really interesting, but I'm not here to talk about late 19th century finances or stock market manipulation. If you want to know more, you should absolutely read The Great Colossus, which I've already quoted from. It is a very interesting story, but it's a video in and of itself. Basically, by 1888, Rhodes had owned the entirety of the De Beers mine, along with a lot of other mines across South Africa, and in that same year, the De Beers Corporation was officially founded. De Beers, before monopoly breakup in the 1950s, controlled between 80 and 90% of all diamond production in the world. This let them single-handedly control the price, which is why diamonds, one of the most common of the rare gemstones, have the reputation they do. This all started when Rhodes set up a cartel that would speed up or slow down production so that they could maintain a constant high price for the product. Again, there are dozens of other gemstones more rare and technically more valuable than diamonds. This is the only reason diamonds are seen as the height of wealth. So, along with bringing a fresh perspective on white supremacy to Africa, the man also brought the groundworks for the blood diamond trade and modern diamond culture as we know it to Africa. If using this alone makes him one of the most important people of the 20th century, you'd be correct. But I'm still only on page 11 of a 24-page script here. You have no idea what else Cecil Rhodes gets up to. His black workers were, of course, treated like subhumans, forced to live in walled-off camps, paid a fraction of what he paid his white workers, and any black worker was forced to do a strip search at the end of every shift to check for stolen diamonds. This would eventually evolve into the practice of De Beers subjecting their black miners to an X-ray at the end of every single shift, pumping them full of needless radiation. But wait, it gets worse. A new statute, simply named the Diamond Trade Act, was passed in 1882 by a coalition of diamond magnates. This meant detectives had the right to search any of the workers' houses without a warrant, and you can probably guess where the main concentration of searches went. Anyone found with just a little scrap of diamond was subject to either a £1,000 fine or 15 years imprisonment. Now, £1,000 back then was more than most people could afford, and something that the black workers could never have any hope to pay, so prison was the more likely option. What made things worse was that once you were accused, it was your job to prove your innocence, not the accuser's job to prove your guilt. None of that innocent until proven guilty crap here. All in all, a great win for the diamond magnates. Yet Rhodes was still disappointed because he wanted to include flogging as a punishment for diamond theft, but even that was a bit barbaric for most of the others. So keep all of that in mind as it's all happening in the background as we go back to 1881. Rhodes graduated college, went back to Africa, and suffered another heart attack. Sadly, he survived this one too, but thought it would be prudent to write his will. This will stipulated that they were to found a secret society that would expand British rule throughout the entire world. He specified he wanted all of Africa, South America, the Holy Land, the seaboard of China and Japan, the Malay Archipelago, Cyprus, Canada, the entirety of the Pacific Islands, and last but not least, to reclaim the United States as a British colony. Now, if you thought the guy was already a big enough piece of shit, hold on to your hats, because he's about to get involved in Cape politics. A lot of other diamond mine owners didn't see the point in getting involved in politics because it would have meant more time spent in Cape Town and less time spent in the mines. But Rhodes was nothing if not a pioneer, and realised that if he were a politician, he could make laws that were friendlier to the people who were trying to gobble up all of the money. So he ran for office. He was only granted a very minor seat, but it was still a win because it was a foot in the door. To career politicians, he gave off a weird impression with his high-pitched, squeaky voice and the way he would sit on his hands and rock back and forth. He would sometimes lie down on the benches and stare straight up at the ceilings, and he would also give notably mediocre speeches. I don't know how something can be notably mediocre, but a lot of people said it. Do with that what you will. But if anything, all of this garnered a lot of support from the normal people. They saw it as some straight shooter who was trying to cut through the nonsense and the rigmarole of British politics and was trying to just cut straight to the core of an issue. Sounds familiar? No? Another good reason to get into Cape politics right now was that there was a lot going on, and if there were big changes on the horizon, Rhodes better have a seat at the table. In 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War took place, and this actually drew a lot of hate from people all over the world. See, the British had very heroically marched into Zulu territory with Maxim machine guns and mortar and top-of-the-line weapons, and slaughtered the Zulu warriors with at best a few old rifles and leather shields. Then, in 1880, the First Boer War took place, where Britain tried to take over Dutch territories on the Cape. This is a fairly minor war, and the Transvaal ended up beating the British, therefore keeping their Dutch dependency. With all this going on, Rhodes slowly worked his way up, and by 1884, the British High Commissioner, with the unfittingly badass name of Sir Hercules Robinson, appointed Rhodes as the Deputy Commissioner in Bechuanaland, or modern-day Botswana. Rhodes could not have been happier with Bechuanaland, as it lay north of the Cape Colony, and therefore furthered his goal of uniting the African continent under British rule from Cape to Cairo, as he so often put it. Bechuanaland is an absolutely colossal piece of land, just a few thousand square miles smaller than Ukraine. But Rhodes' job wouldn't be easy, as Otto von Bismarck just declared all land west of German holdings as German territory, but the Dutch in Stellaland also wanted to lay claim to it. Rhodes went to speak with members of Stellaland, and this is where his true superpower came in. He was incredible at people at getting to agree with his vision, friend or foe. When that didn't work, bribery was always an option too, but his gift for persuasion is what really built his empire. As the story goes, by the time the talks with Stellaland ended, he was already named godfather to one of their sons, and the deal went through after he gave a few concessions. And so, in 1885, Bechuanaland was yet another jewel added to the British crown. As if things couldn't get any worse for the African people, gold was soon discovered in the Witwater Strand in the Transvaal Republic. This caused yet another flood of white dudes with dollar signs in their eyes to flood the region to start buying up plots. And now that they had some experience mining for diamonds, they thought they could use that to start mining for gold. All the major players immediately started buying up plots, but because the Transvaal was Dutch-controlled territory, some of the people wanted to look outside so that they wouldn't have to ask for concessions from a hostile government. Rhodes, not having much luck in Witwater Strand anyway, turned his attention up north yet again to Matabele land, home of the Ndebele people. The Ndebele people were ruled by a king called Lobengula, a man so fearsome and regal-looking that even the white people had to admit that, yeah, this guy looks like a king. In a story that's sadly not unique to Lobengula, Rhodes went into his territory with a treaty that promised the Ndebele weapons and protection against the Portuguese, Dutch and Germans in return for the right to search his land for gold. Had anyone bothered to translate the document accurately for Lobengula, he would have seen that these concessions now turned his kingdom into a proxy battlefield between the colonizing powers that surrounded him. The process actually took quite a while, and Lobengula managed to outsmart everybody for quite a while without ever voicing his opinion one way or the other, which managed to let him keep his power and receive more and more gifts for a long time until people eventually just cracked down and demanded an answer. Again, for the full story, the Flawed Colossus goes into a lot of detail, but sadly it's a story that we just don't have time for today. What matters is, in the end, Rhodes was granted his concession. This was followed by flocks of miners going into the country, building towns, and essentially just taking the land, which also included slaughtering the Ndebele cattle, which was their only real source of wealth and food. And because there were laws that prevented people from just owning armies, Rhodes hired hundreds of men armed with top-of-the-range rifles, mortars, and Maxim guns. And even though they had the equipment of a military regiment, he got around the law by saying, no, this isn't a military. This is just a police force to protect my miners/settlers of this new land. They then marched right through to Mashonaland, where they set up a new fort named Salisbury, named after the current British Prime Minister. Shortly after this, Lobengula and his people fell into somewhat of a civil war, with a lot of people blaming the unfortunate king for what had happened. Lobengula fled, where it said that he died of a broken heart, though it's much more likely that he took poison to end his own life. So with all of this, how did Rhodes react to all of it? He said, "When at last I found myself they were through to Fort Salisbury, I do not think there is a happier man in the country than myself." Again, I kind of had to hop around in the timeline a little bit to make things easier to understand, but anyways, what's important now is by 1898, Cecil decided to rename the countries that he had taken to be a little more civilized. Genuine considerations were given to the names Rhodesland, and at one point even Cecilia. But in the end, he went with the name Rhodesia. For anyone who knows what Rhodesia is, I'm sure a chill just went down your spine. For anyone who has no idea what Rhodesia is, don't worry, we'll get to that at the end. For now, back to his political career in the Cape. What started as a fairly minor argument over where to expand rail lines, with all of the diamond miners wanting to expand them into Kimberly for obvious selfish reasons, that they can get their diamonds and supplies in and out quicker. This, for some reason, caused the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony to resign. So just 2 weeks after his pioneer column set off through Mashonaland, Cecil Rhodes was now the Prime Minister of the British Cape Colony. To put all of this into perspective, I'm going to give you quite a long quote from the Flawed Colossus. By any judgment, this must be seen as an extraordinary feat. Whatever one may think of Rhodes, however much one questions his methods, criticizes his scale of values and deplores his ruthlessness, intolerance and egocentricity, it is impossible not to be amazed at his achievements. Consider what he had done in 20 years. The 20 years when most young men are struggling to find their feet. He had arrived in South Africa an ailing, inconspicuous and, to all outward appearances, unpromising youth. He had neither name nor influence to help him. He had educated himself. He had built one of the largest financial empires in the world. He had organized the occupation of a vast territory. He had become Prime Minister, and he was only 37 years old. That Rhodes was to become known as the Colossus was perhaps inevitable. So that's what's kind of depressing about Cecil Rhodes. A lot of the time when you read about horrible people in history, they just kind of failed upwards and upwards through the incompetence of the people around them. But as much as I hate Cecil Rhodes, everything he did, he was excellent at. He just chose to do exclusively terrible things. But yeah, at just 37 years old, he was now Prime Minister of one country, while the personal owner of two others. And I say personal owner because his takeover of Matabeleland and Mashonaland were not wanted by the Crown. Politicians, newspapers, and even normal people back home thought that these were just needless land grabs and that he was expanding the empire too quickly. The entire reason behind colonizing these places, as they saw it, was so that they could spread civilization to these places. This meant at least a tiny bit of infrastructure, healthcare, education. How much the people who lived here actually benefited from these things didn't really matter. So long as the people back home in London could read in the newspapers that India just got more trains, or South Africa just got another school or hospital, they could keep their sense of moral superiority. Rhodes wasn't even trying to keep up appearances at this point. It was just about the land and spreading the culture. This is all very funny coming from a man who seemingly couldn't even bear to be in England. I mean, he only went back when it was absolutely necessary for him to do so. Speaking of going back to England, he had now to make a return trip, but instead of a terrible student, now he was to go back as an A-list celebrity. He got to rub elbows with no less than Lord Rothschild, Lord Randolph Churchill, father of, Winston Churchill, and none other than the famine queen herself, Victoria. All this to say, he's gotten quite damn far from his humble beginnings in Africa. But he didn't really care about being a celebrity. He wanted to work on policies that would shape not just his holdings in Africa, but hopefully all of Africa. Policies that for some reason still get defended to this day, but in reality they laid the groundwork for apartheid in South Africa, which only ended in the early 1990s. Part of why Rhodes is defended to this day is because a lot of people fully drink his Kool-Aid and believe he was only there to elevate the status of Africans. As we've seen, he believed them all to be children, and in practice, he treats them even worse than children. What we're going to see next shows who he really was. Before Rhodes, the Cape Colony was actually pretty forward. Any man, black or white, could vote in elections so long as he had property of at least £25. Obviously, this did exclude a lot of African people, but it was pretty bog standard for most of Europe, where only men with a certain value of property could vote. Well, Rhodes introduced the Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892, which tripled this £25 requirement to £75, and also added a literacy test, which disenfranchised almost the entirety of the black population, as well as a lot of the poorer white population who may have had more in common with their black co-workers other than, with the white mine owners. Rhodes didn't even try to hide his feelings either. He admitted that he was scared soon black people were going to win seats in local elections, and the Franchise and Ballot Act pretty much put an end to any of that competition. To quote from an article I found on the long-term effects of this act published by the University of Cape Town, quote, This legislation settled the disputes as to whether non-whites had voting power in Cape Colony in the late 19th century, and is recognised as being an early example of legislation motivated by racial discrimination. Although the law itself achieved its racially discriminatory aims only indirectly through financially based clauses. Which sums things up pretty well. Nowhere in the law does it say that they want to stop black or poor people from participating in politics. That was just a happy coincidence. The next one, somehow worse than his last, was the Glengarry Act of 1894. This is one of Rhodes' longest lasting legacies, and one which he proudly called a Bill for Africa, which shows just how much he wanted this to spread. All he wanted to do was switch from the traditional African way of having communally owned land into an individual owned land system. In reality, all he did was impose a hut tax. So any farmers that were just living off the land and didn't have to interact anyway with the settlers still had to do some work during the year just to pay the tax. It also meant that a family couldn't pass their land down to their children. They had to pick one child, usually the eldest son, to pass the land on to. The rest would have to leave their homeland behind and move to the city in search of work. Like I said earlier, Rhodes could not stand the idea of anybody being lazy, and he saw somebody just living on a homestead and supporting themselves and their family and their community as being lazy somehow. Of course, ask anybody, would they rather a plot of land and enough food to survive, feed their family and hang out with their community, or would they rather dig for diamonds or dig roads through rainforests with incredibly high death rates, all for a negligible wage? I think I know which one most people would vote for. Because he knew that if all these people are leaving their ancestral land to come to the city, he also didn't want a flood of black people coming to the city all of a sudden. But don't worry, he thought of a plan for that too. The white population, no matter how poor they were allowed to move into the city, no problems. The black population, however, were forced into reservations, which led to the usual problems of malnutrition, disease, and practically no education, unless it was in a trade school where they could learn practical skills. The commission setting up these plots in the Glengarry region suggested giving each family 55 morgens, a pretty generous unit of land equal to about 33 acres. Cecil Rhodes cut this down to 4 morgens and kept the rest for the colonists. About the Glengarry Act, Cecil Rhodes would say, "If the Glengarry policy is a success, we shall see neighbouring states adopting it. I hope we shall have one native policy in South Africa." These laws have shaped South Africa ever since, and is why to this day people say South Africa is almost like 2 countries, one for white people and one for black people. Although apartheid technically ended 30 years ago, that's not a long time, especially when the country was built with a very specific race-oriented vision for over 100 years. Now, one gripe I have with the Flawed Colossus is that the author really doesn't give Cecil Rhodes enough guff for this and says that the South African government would have developed apartheid anyways. And of course that's possibly true, but it was a hell of a lot easier to come along and just tweak the laws that Cecil Rhodes had already done, and especially when black people were already living in reservations, white people were already living in cities, the South African government just had to keep that ball rolling. That was a lot. So let's take a look at some of the things in Rhodes' life that weren't going so well. Because expanding into Mashonaland and Matabele land was very expensive, Rhodes decided to put all of his ventures under one umbrella corporation, simply called the Chartered Company. This let him take money or funds from things that were going well, like his diamond mines, and shuffle things around to cover the costs of things that weren't going so well to try and fool investors. Also kind of making him the father of modern day shell corporations. Because like I said, Matabeleland and Mashonaland, taking them over had been expensive, but he hoped that discovery of gold there would offset the costs. That gold, however, was never found. Now, this isn't really a big L for Cecil, more like a lowercase l, but a bigger one is on its way. Rhodes had been planning and plotting with one Dr. Jameson, who, as the name might suggest, was Rhodes' doctor. But Rhodes noticed that he had that cutthroat capitalist attitude that he needed so badly. so he had started to rely more and more on him to do his dirty work. It was Jameson that led Rhodes's 3,500 men column to Fort Salisbury, now capital of Rhodesia, and it was Jameson that systematically erased the Ndebele way of life. Now, though, Rhodes had bigger plans for Jameson. For a while, the Crown had been happy to leave things peaceful with their Dutch, Portuguese, and German neighbours, and the Crown still was. But Rhodes's old friend, and now shareholder in Rhodes's chartered company, Sir Hercules Robinson, was once again the High Commissioner for South Africa. Rhodes was very easily able to sway him over to the cause of England should take the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. He had plotted with some people living in Johannesburg, then in Transvaal, and he planned that he would stage an uprising that would free the people from their tyrannical government, to which Rhodes and his men would swoop in and save the day, liberating these people to the British Crown. Who else would lead the charge but Dr. Jameson? Keep in mind, Rhodes was doing this without the knowledge of the Crown, and he knew that nobody would approve of it unless total victory had been achieved. So Rhodes had to keep this very hush-hush, and so he sent Jameson and his men just to the frontiers between the Cape and the Transvaal, where they would cut telegraph wires upon the signals that the Boers couldn't get word out about what was happening. Well, the raid was called off, but Jameson decided to Leroy Jenkins that shit and he charged. He ordered the telegraph wire cut, but the men accidentally just cut a random wire fence instead, and the attack was launched at the end of December in 1895. Immediately, the rebellion was crushed, and word got out about who was involved, and the invasion was fully withdrawn just 3 days later. Rhodes was very clever and was able to keep his name from any hard evidence, so he was never charged for the activity. But Jameson was sentenced to prison until his ill health got him an early release. Though he wasn't criminally charged, this did enough to destroy Rhodes's reputation, as everybody knew he was behind it. In the next election, he wasn't re-elected as Prime Minister of the Cape, and thankfully, he would never get to invade anyone ever again. That said, everyone around him still loved him, because when you're that rich and influential, a little bit of light treason isn't going to ruin your reputation. But the tensions that this race set up would be one of the dominoes that led to the Second Boer War of 1899. The war where England finally got control of the entirety of South Africa, but also one of the first uses in history of concentration camps, with Britain using them extensively on the Boers and, more importantly, on the native Africans in the region. Because nobody bothered to record native deaths, those are pretty much impossible to track. However, Boer men were mostly shipped overseas where they could work as colonial labour, while an estimated 26,000 women and children were left behind in the camps to perish. Obviously, I'm not blaming Rhodes directly for this. He did not decide to launch the Second Boer War. He definitely did not decide to use concentration camps on the Boers or the native population. But his actions in previous years led a direct role in the start of this, so his hands aren't entirely clean of this either. That was all very depressing, I know, but don't worry, I have some good news for you. By early 1902, Rhodes's illnesses started to get the best of him. When friends came out to hunt, including a young Winston Churchill, he was apparently too sick to do what he had once loved so much. It started to worsen and he was bedbound. Struggling to breathe, people started to knock down the walls in his house to try to improve the airflow, but it was no use. For 3 days he was pretty much unconscious, and by the 26th of March 1902, Cecil Rhodes breathed his last and finally died. With all that Cecil Rhodes accomplished in his life, you might be surprised to know that when he died he was only 48 years old. He managed to squeeze a lot into those 48 years. Now, surely him knowing that he could have died at any moment might have given him the motivation to do all that he did, but thankfully he didn't live for another 3 or 4 decades for us to find out for sure. None other than Dr. Jameson stepped out to a road that had been thronged with people since he had taken to bed to announce his death. His coffin was then brought to a mountain peak that he named World's View, a place that he had picked out years before for its beauty and magnificence, but which was, funnily enough, very lackluster to everybody he showed it to. Rudyard Kipling himself composed a poem for the Colossus's death, But others were not so warm in their memories, with Le Tron of France writing, "Rhodes lived only for his schemes and enjoyed life only as a cannonball enjoys space, travelling to its aim blindly and spreading ruin on its way. He was a great man, no doubt, a man who rendered immense services to his country, but humanity is not much indebted to him." Sadly, Cecil's death is not the end of his story. Earlier, I told you we would have to have a talk about Rhodesia. Well, let's talk. To preface this, just like the Second Boer War, obviously Cecil is not responsible for a lot of what happened. He was dead when all of the stuff I'm going to tell you about actually happened. But again, without his legal and philosophical groundworks that built the state of Rhodesia, a lot of this may not have happened, or at least would have happened to a lesser scale. So let's get into Rhodesia. Again, it was founded in 1895, officially just 7 years before his death. It was split into North and South Rhodesia in 1911. By October 1923, Southern Rhodesia was annexed by the UK, and it's Southern Rhodesia that we're going to be focusing on right now. Skip forward a few decades to 1964, and Ian Smith was elected as the Prime Minister. Although he was the son of colonists and was white, he was the first Rhodesian-born Prime Minister. And in Rhodesia, although only 5 to 7% of the population were white, black people did not have the right to vote. By 1965, they were ordered to abolish minority rule, or aka allow black people the right to enter politics and to vote. They declined, and so the global community imposed heavy sanctions on them. 2 armed divisions of the majority black political parties popped up. These were the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army and, more importantly, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, led by Robert Mugabe, who deserves his own video. The USSR and the Chinese Communist Party were sending weapons to the so-called terrorists. We'll get into that in a minute. While the South African government was sending clandestine support to the Rhodesians. This led to a brutal 15-year civil war with atrocities on both sides. Like I said, the 2 groups who rose up were definitely terrorist groups committing terrorist actions. But again, they were fighting against a brutal regime who had set up an apartheid far, far worse than South Africa, who had been living on their native land for thousands of years and now didn't even have the right to vote. So, while I'm not excusing their atrocities, you also have to see where they're coming from. And again, Rhodesia did not have freedom of press. And so a lot of their atrocities were exaggerated or just straight up fabricated by the Rhodesian government. And the Rhodesians were not innocent of war crimes either. This led to the Rhodesian government's infamous Selous Scouts, who allegedly used anthrax on the civilian population, as well as deploying poisoned clothes and food to be left where the insurgents would find them, but which of course led to the deaths of countless innocent civilians. Eventually they would gain their independence as recently as 1980, with Northern Rhodesia becoming Zambia and Southern Rhodesia becoming Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe will become the first president of the newly born Zimbabwe and ruin the country in a whole other way. Ian Smith called the entire war an ungentlemanly footnote. Although Rhodesia may have died, their influence has not, with Rhodesia still going on to inspire many neo-Nazi groups to this day, including Dylan Roof, an American white supremacist, neo-Nazi and mass murderer who perpetrated the Charleston church shooting in 2015, where 9 people died. He carried out the shooting while wearing a jacket emblazoned with the Rhodesian flag. To end things on a bit of a lighter note, let's go back to where we started. Talk about diamonds. After Rhodes' death, the price of diamonds continued to skyrocket, especially with the diamonds are forever shtick that I mentioned at the start of the video. But eventually discovery of diamond mines in places like Russia and China that De Beers couldn't get their greedy mitts on meant that they couldn't so easily control the price anymore. Also, in recent years, the discovery of lab-grown diamonds has made mining for diamonds all but obsolete, although aficionados still cling to the belief that, hey, if it's not a blood diamond, it's worthless. Which is dumb. We finally made an ethical version of a diamond, and people are still saying it's a wrong diamond. Anyway, De Beers in 2011 was bought out by the giant megacorp of Anglo American. As it stands, De Beers only pulls in about 13% of the revenue for this scarily giant corporation, with iron and copper pulling in a combined 43%. So that leaves the future of De Beers kind of up in the air. And that's pretty much it for the story of Cecil Rhodes. To sum up, I don't think I can do any better than Robert I. Rotberg put it in The Founder. He was greatly hated and greatly loved. Indifference towards Rhodes was an impossibility. Thank you so much again for making it to the end of the video. I know this one was much more depressing than my last video, but Cecil Rhodes has kind of been an obsession of mine for a long time, and obviously a very influential figure, especially in Africa, but even to all of our lives. And in terms of historical tyrants, he seems to have kind of gotten off scot-free. And so I hope you learned something from this video. And again, I had to leave out a lot of stuff. So if you want, definitely go check out The Founder or The Flawed Colossus. They're both fantastic books. As always, those, along with any other sources I use for this video, will be below in the description. If you can think of any other video you want to see, maybe Robert Mugabe or any other figure, any other random topic, leave a comment below. Subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Slán live.